Welcome to Have You Read It, the channel where we bring books to life one summary at a time. Today we're tackling a true behemoth of economic thought, Adam Smith's An Inquiry into the Nature and Causes of the Wealth of Nations. Published in 1776, this book isn't just a historical artifact, it's the bedrock of modern economics, influencing everything from how we understand markets to international trade and government policy. So buckle up, grab your favorite beverage, and get ready for a deep dive into the wealth of nations. Smith kicks things off by exploring the very core of productivity, the division of labor. He uses the classic example of a pin factory to illustrate his point. Imagine one person trying to make an entire pin from start to finish, drawing the wire, straightening it, cutting it, sharpening it, and so on. It would be a slow and inefficient process. But when you divide the task into specialized roles, with each worker focusing on a single operation, productivity skyrockets. Smith observes that this specialization drastically increases output due to three main factors: increased dexterity, saving time otherwise lost switching tasks, and the invention of labor-saving machinery. This concept, though simple, revolutionized manufacturing, and continues to be relevant in our modern, specialized world. But there's a catch. The division of labor can only be beneficial if there's a market large enough to absorb all those pins. Smith highlights that the extent of the market dictates the extent of specialization. If you're making pins for a tiny village, you won't need, or be able to sustain, 18 specialized pin makers. This underscores the importance of trade and transportation in enabling economic growth. Think about how globalization has expanded markets and driven specialization in our current era. So, what drives this division of labor in the first place? Smith argues that it's a fundamental human propensity to truck, barter, and exchange one thing for another. We're inherently social creatures, always looking for ways to improve our situation through trade. It's not from the benevolence of the butcher, the brewer, or the baker that we expect our dinner, but from their regard to their own self-interest. This concept of self-interest as a driver of economic activity is central to Smith's work. Of course, no discussion of trade can ignore the crucial role of money. Smith details how money emerged as a medium of exchange, evolving from cumbersome systems of bartering. Metals, especially gold and silver, emerged as preferred mediums due to their durability, divisibility, and ease of unification. This enabled more precise and efficient transactions, fueling economic growth. Now, Smith distinguishes between value in use and value in exchange. Water, essential for life, has high value in use, but low value in exchange. A diamond, on the other hand, has little practical use, but high exchange value. Smith explores the factors determining this exchange value, emphasizing labor as the real measure of a commodity's value. The real price of anything, he argues, is the toil and trouble of acquiring it. However, we don't usually estimate value in terms of labor, but in terms of money, the nominal price. Moving beyond individual commodities, Smith analyzes the components of price in a more advanced society: wages paid to labor, profit returned to the owner of stock, and rent paid to the landlord for the use of land. He carefully distinguishes between these three and demonstrates how they interact to determine a commodity's natural price. The interplay between a commodity's natural price and its actual market price is a key element in Smith's analysis. Market price is driven by supply and demand. If supply falls short of demand, prices rise. If supply exceeds demand, prices fall. The market, left to its own devices, constantly works towards an equilibrium where market price equals natural price. Smith explores the factors influencing wages, profit, and rent. Wages, he says, depend on both the demand for labor and the cost of the necessities of life. Profit is influenced by the overall wealth of the society and the competition between businesses. Rent is determined by the productivity and location of land. Smith's discussion of rent is particularly illuminating. He distinguishes between produce that always yields rent, like food, and produce that doesn't always yield rent, like timber or stone. He also discusses how improvements in agriculture affect rent, and how rent makes up a significant portion of the price of commodities. Smith then embarks on a historical digression about the value of silver over 4 centuries, acknowledging the complexity of tracing long-term price trends. He observes fluctuating periods of high and low silver value, attributing these variations to factors like the discovery of American mines and changes in supply and demand. He uses historical data and market analysis to support his observations, although he acknowledges the difficulty of obtaining completely accurate records. In Book 2, the focus shifts to capital, the engine of economic growth. Smith emphasizes that capital, not just the number of workers, is crucial for expanding industry. He divides capital into fixed capital, like machines and buildings, and circulating capital, like wages and raw materials. He then discusses the role of money not just as a medium of exchange, but as a vital part of the circulating capital that drives industry. Smith contrasts the nature of capital accumulation in rich and poor countries. In rich countries, a larger portion of the annual produce goes towards replacing the capital of the rich and independent farmer rather than the landlord, as was the case under feudalism. This increased capital fuels economic expansion. He argues that saving, or parsimony, rather than just hard work, is the driver of increased capital, enabling the maintenance and expansion of productive labor. He also notes that public prodigality and unsuccessful projects can drain productive capital, hindering growth. The role of lending and borrowing is also scrutinized. Smith observes that lending at interest is normally for productive purposes, not for consumption. Borrowing to spend will lead to ruin. The amount of money that can be lent depends on the portion of annual produce available beyond what the owner needs. As capital grows, he explains, competition among lenders drives down interest rates. How capital is employed also significantly impacts its productivity. Smith outlines 4 key sectors: agriculture, manufacturing, wholesale trade, and retail trade. He argues that for society as a whole, agriculture is the most productive sector, followed by manufacturing, then wholesale, and finally retail. He acknowledges that individual self-interest, rather than public good, motivates people's choice of employment, but he argues that this individual pursuit indirectly benefits society. He observes that new colonies tend to thrive initially because their capital is primarily devoted to agriculture, which creates the foundation for subsequent economic expansion. Book 3 examines how different nations have pursued economic development. Smith argues that the natural progress of opulence is for a society to focus first on agriculture, then manufacturing, and finally foreign trade. However, European policy post-Roman Empire inverted this order, prioritizing trade and manufacturing over agriculture. Smith blames the feudal system for this inversion. He details how the law of primogeniture and entails designed to preserve large landholdings discouraged improvement. Large landowners, often more concerned with prestige than profit, were not the best improvers, and their tenant farmers had little incentive to invest in improvements. In contrast, the rise of towns and cities spurred economic growth. As towns offered refuge and opportunity, they attracted labor and capital, fostering the growth of manufactures and commerce. This urban growth, in turn, stimulated agricultural improvements by creating a larger market for agricultural produce. Smith argues that the commerce between towns and the countryside is mutually beneficial, increasing the wealth of both. Smith details 3 ways in which towns contributed to rural development. They provide a ready market for agricultural goods. The wealth accumulated in towns is often invested in rural land improvement, and commerce promotes order and good government, leading to increased liberty and security, which encourages further economic development. He emphasizes how this process gradually extends beyond the immediate vicinity of towns, thanks in part to improved transportation. In Book 4, Smith turns his critical eye to the 2 dominant economic systems of his time, mercantilism and physiocracy. He dissects the mercantile system, which equated national wealth with the accumulation of gold and silver. He challenges the notion that a favorable balance of trade is essential for national prosperity, arguing that the real wealth lies in the annual produce of land and labor. Smith challenges common mercantilist practices, such as restrictions on importation. He argues that if a foreign country can supply us with a commodity cheaper than we can make it, it's better to buy it from them with some part of the produce of our own industry, employed in a way in which we have some advantage. This is one of the most central tenets of free trade theory. He points out that focusing on domestic production of something cheaper to import diminishes the nation's revenue. He also scrutinizes the extraordinary restraints on imports from countries with which a nation supposedly has an unfavorable balance of trade. He argues that such restraints are often driven by national prejudice rather than sound economic principles. He notes the difficulty of accurately calculating the balance of trade, and he critiques the use of custom house books and exchange rates as unreliable indicators. In a lengthy digression on banks of deposit, particularly the Bank of Amsterdam, Smith explains the workings of these institutions and their role in international trade. He notes the advantages of bank money over common currency, particularly its stability and its use in paying foreign bills of exchange. Smith argues against the use of retaliatory tariffs. While he acknowledges that they might be justified in specific cases to encourage the repeal of foreign tariffs, he generally considers them counterproductive, ultimately harming the retaliating nation's own consumers. Smith also discusses drawbacks and bounties, arguing that drawbacks, which refund duties paid on imported goods later re-exported, are a more reasonable form of encouragement than bounties paid on exported goods. Drawbacks, he argues, simply restore the natural balance of trade by mitigating the effect of duties. Bounties, on the other hand, distort this balance by artificially encouraging the production of certain goods for export, even when it might be more efficient to import them. He points out that bounties impose a double tax on the people, the tax to pay the bounty and the tax arising from higher domestic prices. Smith dedicates considerable space to the corn trade and corn laws, arguing that the bounty on corn export, designed to promote British agriculture, is ill-conceived. He breaks down the corn trade into 4 distinct branches: inland dealing, importing for domestic consumption, exporting domestic produce, and carrying trade. He concludes that restrictions on the grain trade are harmful, echoing his arguments for free trade in general. Treaties of commerce, often touted as beneficial by mercantilists, are also scrutinized. Smith argues that while they might grant an advantage to certain favored merchants and manufacturers, they create a monopoly against the consumers of the favoring country, leading to higher prices and potentially diminishing the nation's overall wealth. He dissects the Methuen Treaty with Portugal as an example, highlighting its asymmetry in favoring Portugal's wine trade at the expense of British consumers. Smith then examines the various forms of colonies and colonial policy, distinguishing between the motives behind ancient and modern colonies. Ancient Greek colonies were often driven by necessity due to limited land, while Roman colonies served a strategic purpose, securing conquered territories. Modern European colonies, he says, were driven by a sacred thirst for gold and other resources. While acknowledging the benefits of new colonies in terms of land availability, freedom from rent and taxes, and the resulting incentives for improvement and population growth, Smith criticizes the mercantile system's impact on colonial development. He argues that monopolies on colonial trade, while benefiting certain merchants, hinder the overall prosperity both of the colonies and the mother country. He points out that the English colonies in North America were able to thrive, in spite of mercantile restrictions, because of greater land availability and more liberal local government compared to other European colonies. The final book, Book 5, explores public finance, discussing the appropriate expenditures and revenue sources for the government. Smith identifies 4 main categories of public expenditure: defense, justice, public works and institutions, and maintaining the dignity of the sovereign. He argues that defense and sovereign dignity should be funded by the general contribution of society, while the cost of justice could be covered by court fees, and local projects should be financed by local revenues. Smith lays out 4 maxims of taxation: equality, certainty, convenience of payment, and efficiency. He then meticulously examines various types of taxes, including taxes on land rent, houses, profits, wages, and consumable commodities. He dissects each tax with his characteristic detailed analysis, discussing its incidence, its impact on different social groups, and its advantages and disadvantages. He consistently champions efficiency and opposes taxes that discourage industry or create unnecessary burdens on the public. Smith dedicates an extensive section to public debt, arguing that the practice of funding or creating long-term government debt, though expedient in times of war, ultimately weakens the state. He outlines the historical progression of public debt, and he points out that while funding provides temporary relief, it diverts resources from productive use and creates a perpetual burden on future generations. He also notes that the sinking fund, while designed to reduce debt, is often misapplied to other government expenses. Smith doesn't simply criticize existing systems, he offers a constructive alternative: the system of natural liberty. This system rests on the principle that every man, as long as he does not violate the laws of justice, is left perfectly free to pursue his own interest his own way. This freedom, Smith argues, naturally leads to the most efficient allocation of resources and the greatest possible increase in the annual produce of land and labor, generating the most wealth for individuals and society as a whole. The sovereign, in this system, has only 3 duties: defense, justice, and maintaining certain public works and institutions. So, what are the key takeaways from The Wealth of Nations? The division of labor and free exchange are the engines of productivity and wealth creation. Government interference, through monopolies, tariffs, and bounties, distorts the natural allocation of resources and hinders economic growth. The true wealth of a nation lies not in gold and silver, but in the annual produce of its land and labor. The system of natural liberty promotes the greatest prosperity by allowing individuals to pursue their self-interest within the bounds of justice. These ideas, first articulated over 2 centuries ago, continue to shape economic thought and policy today. Understanding these principles provides a powerful framework for navigating the complexities of the modern economic world. Thanks for watching. Make sure to give this video a thumbs up and hit that subscribe button so you never miss our next book dive.